Hey friends, tonight we slip quietly into the shadows of the medieval world, not to marvel at knights or castles, but to uncover the quiet tragedies that rarely made the history books. Medieval life wasn't all grand battles or royal feasts. Sometimes, the tiniest misstep, a stray loaf, a fallen stick, a single word, could cost you everything. So before we drift into these forgotten stories, take a second to like the video and subscribe if you truly connect with what I do here. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is. I love seeing this late-night community come together. Now, dim your lights, settle in, and let's gently explore the small crimes that changed lives forever. The widow who picked fallen firewood without permission. Imagine yourself walking through a quiet forest just after a storm. The ground is soft with moisture, and the trees above sway gently as the last of the wind dies down. Among the moss-covered trunks and tangled brambles, fallen branches lie scattered like forgotten bones. The air is thick with the scent of damp earth and broken bark. In this silence, a widow moves slowly, gathering a few small pieces of wood. She does not carry a basket, only the folds of her apron, bundled to hold what she can. Her steps are careful, not out of stealth, but because the forest floor is uneven, and she cannot afford a twisted ankle. She picks the branches not from trees, not from fences or stored piles, but from the ground, sticks left behind by nature itself after the storm passed through. They will burn quickly, she knows, but they are dry enough to take a flame, and her home is cold. Her children have no father. The bread is thin. The nights are long. So she bends, again and again, filling her arms with the debris of a storm. But this forest, like nearly all forests in medieval Europe, is not free. And the wood, even when fallen by wind and rain, is not hers to take. In many medieval villages, forests were communal only in memory. By law, by charter, or by royal grant, they belonged to a lord, a monastery, or the crown. This enclosure was not always visible. There were no fences, no gates. The division lived in the minds of those who knew their place. In some villages, collecting windfall, wood naturally felled by storms, was permitted in narrow windows or under special licenses. In others, it was not. The lines shifted by region, by decade, and by the temperament of those who owned the trees. But one rule was often clear. If a poor widow walked into the lord's woods and gathered wood without permission, it was theft. And so, her simple act, bending to lift twigs from the wet ground, became, in the eyes of law and custom, a crime. The punishments for this kind of offense were not always physical, but they could be harsh. Public shaming was common. A woman caught with even a small bundle of sticks might be brought before the manorial court, where her name was entered into the records as a thief. She might be fined beyond her ability to pay. If she had rights to common land, rights to gather herbs, graze a goat, or draw water, they could be revoked. In some cases, the mere accusation was enough to cause her neighbors to turn away. A woman already widowed, already poor, could fall into a social silence from which few returned. Imagine that, not only the hunger, not only the cold, but the quiet kind of disgrace. No one slams a door. No one throws stones. They simply stop offering help. They stop lending flour. They stop watching her children for an hour. She is still in the village, but now she walks through it unseen. It is tempting to imagine that rules like this were cruel by design, but often they were born from scarcity. Wood was not merely fuel, it was wealth. It built homes, heated ovens, made tools, and brewed ale. For a lord or an abbey, the right to control forest land was both symbolic and deeply practical. It meant income, influence, and the power to decide who stayed warm and who did not. To allow too many to gather firewood freely would, they feared, exhaust the land. Yet there were contradictions. In times of harsh winter or after great storms, fallen wood piled high, untouched, even as the poor froze. Those who collected it out of need often did so at dawn or dusk, not because they felt guilt, but because they feared consequence. The records that survive are fragmentary. A few faded pages from manorial courts, lines scrawled in Latin or Old French. They speak of una vidua, a widow, found with ligna mortua, dead wood. In one record from the early 14th century, a woman was fined a whole day's wages for lifting 6 sticks. In another, the court recommended her to mercy, but still stripped her of her gathering rights. There is no mention of the weather that day or the hunger in her home, only that the law had spoken. Some widows became known by these small infractions. Villagers whispered. Children, too young to understand law, learned the lesson anyway. The forest was not for everyone. But the forest remembered her differently. It held no grudge. The trees she passed did not lean away. The moss did not recoil. The wind still passed through the branches in the same rhythm it always had. And long after her name faded from the court rolls, the ground continued to gather fallen sticks. Occasionally, these acts sparked quiet rebellion. A group of women might gather together, entering the woods at once, not to challenge the law openly, but to blur its edge. If 10 women carried wood out of the forest, and only one was punished, the others still warmed their homes. These were not riots. They were survivals. It is also worth remembering that not all lords were rigid, and not all laws were enforced with equal severity. Some communities developed informal understandings, seasonal permissions, or allowed widows a little more leniency. But this mercy was rarely written down. It could vanish with a change of steward or a new heir with colder priorities. Today, we might pass by a pile of branches without a second thought. We might forget that, for hundreds of years, the line between survival and punishment could be drawn in something as small as a stick. So the story of the widow who picked fallen firewood is not just about one woman or one storm. It is about the way systems are built around ownership, how poverty shapes what counts as a crime, and how even acts of care, like warming a child, can become transgressions when the world is shaped against the poor. As you lie back now and let your thoughts drift, remember this: the forest is quiet again. The branches have fallen. Somewhere in the past, a woman once bent to gather them, hoping for warmth, and was punished for her hope. She lived on, quietly, but not forgotten. The boy who let the village goat slip its rope. Imagine a morning that begins with the sound of wooden shutters creaking open to let in a pale, cloud-muted sun. The air carries the cool scent of earth still wet from the night's mist. In a small medieval village, nestled between worn hills and thatched roofs, the rhythm of life begins not with alarms, but with the quiet routines of necessity. There is bread to shape before sunrise, water to fetch before the line at the well grows long, and animals to feed before they grow restless and begin to bleat. Among these animals is the village goat, perhaps just one, perhaps a few, tied carefully to a post outside a cottage with crumbling wattle walls. Goats were not extravagances. They were assets. They gave milk that could be turned to soft cheese, curd, or even a kind of rustic butter. They nibbled unwanted weeds, helped clear plots of land, and in lean times, their presence might mean the difference between hunger and nourishment. For a poor family, a goat wasn't just a beast, it was a fragile lifeline. In this village, a boy, still in the thick of childhood, but old enough to be trusted with light duties, had been tasked with watching the family's goat. His job was simple, or so it seemed. Keep the goat tethered, watch that it did not stray. Perhaps he had done this 100 times before, lulled into the illusion of routine. But on this particular day, with the breeze warm and the cobblestones radiating a sleepy heat, he sat down beside the tethered animal, rested his chin on his hand, and closed his eyes for just a moment. The goat, naturally, had other ideas. Goats are curious and opportunistic, driven not by malice but by the scent of something tender, something green. A loose knot, a frayed rope, a moment of inattention, and the animal wandered. Not into the road or the market square, but into a place more sacred than it might appear, the communal garden. These gardens were not idle hobby plots. In most medieval villages, they were carefully tended shared spaces, governed by strict customs. Rules dictated who could plant, who could harvest, and what protection must be placed around fragile shoots. In a time when even a few spoiled roots could mean an empty stomach come winter, the law around growing food was not symbolic, it was survival. To let an animal trample or chew tender growth was to risk the balance of need and harvest. The garden represented a fragile collective effort. The goat's hooves crushed young onion stems. Its teeth found the soft tips of pea shoots. It did not get far before someone shouted, perhaps a woman weeding nearby, or a boy from another family running errands. The village reeve was summoned. There would be no forgiveness. Punishment in these cases rarely involved the child. The goat was not his. The mistake, though his, was viewed through the lens of property and responsibility. His family bore the weight. Grazing privileges, granted by communal agreement and often the only means by which animals could feed without trespassing, were stripped from them. No more access to common fields or hedgerows. That meant not just the goat, but any other livestock they owned would go hungry unless fed by purchased feed, something well beyond the family's meager coin. There was also a fine. Not to be paid in silver, for they had none, but perhaps in grain or in the form of unpaid labor owed to the village. A father might spend a month mending fences for the manor. A mother might lose her turn at the communal oven. The burden would linger, quiet and invisible, curling around the family like fog. There was no courtroom, no loud declarations of guilt, just a shift in the rhythm of their days. The boy, too young to understand the full chain of consequence, would notice the way the neighbors stopped exchanging extra milk. He would hear his parents' low voices late into the evening. He would carry the weight of that one moment of sleepiness for years. And yet, this was not cruelty in the way we often imagine. The villagers did not hate the boy. The rules were not meant to shame him. The system was simply too delicate to allow leeway. Land was limited. Time was precious. Food was never assured. Every failure of vigilance risked unraveling something others had carefully stitched together. Medieval justice for such matters was deeply social. It was not about punishment for punishment's sake. It was about maintaining the fragile agreements that held daily life together. The consequence of losing grazing rights did not just mark one family, it served as a reminder to all that nothing in village life was truly private, that even the smallest lapse had public weight. Over time, the boy likely found other chores. The goat may have been sold, or it may have been kept secretly, fed from weeds pulled by hand in the night. The family adjusted because they had to, but their place in the village shifted ever so slightly. Trust, once frayed, takes seasons to mend. The story is quiet. There is no violence, no rebellion, no grand collapse. Just a boy, a rope, a goat, and the precise machinery of medieval life clicking forward without pause. If you close your eyes now, you might picture the goat's hooves echoing against stone, the rustle of its coat as it moved toward those forbidden greens. You might picture the boy, startled awake, scrambling to his feet, but already too late. The garden was breached. The balance was broken. And nothing in that small village would be quite the same again. The woman who borrowed a cooking pot without asking. Imagine a village where every sound carries, every gesture is noted, and every pot, pan, and pail has a known history. The iron cooking pot, in this place, was not just a vessel. It was a symbol of order, of trust, of memory, of shared necessity. It boiled soups that fed the sick, simmered grains through the longest winters, and held the echoes of 1,000 borrowed meals. In such a world, the act of borrowing was woven into daily life, but so too was the expectation that it be asked for aloud, in daylight, with witnesses if possible. Silence, even well-meaning silence, was dangerous. The woman we speak of had no name that outlived the story. She lived in a thatched home with a sagging lintel and a garden just big enough to grow bitter greens and a few rows of leeks. Her hands were always busy, kneading dough, scrubbing linen, smoothing soil. She was neither rich nor especially poor, and that made her invisible in a way that only the average can be. She had no husband to speak for her, no father to temper judgment in the eyes of the elders, and no children to shield her from suspicion. It was a day much like any other. The air smelled faintly of soot and cabbage, as it often did in cooking season. Her own pot had cracked days earlier, too many heating cycles, too many careless scrubbings with gritty ash. A neighbor's pot, she knew, sat idle that morning, its owner off visiting a distant cousin for a christening. The distance was not great, and she had borrowed before, with permission. But this time, she didn't ask. She slipped quietly through the gap in the hedge, lifted the heavy iron pot from the neighbor's stoop, and carried it home, careful not to chip it. She washed it first, out of habit, then filled it with barley, onion peel, and whatever bones she had saved from the last market visit. The soup boiled gently all day, filling her little house with the warm, thick scent of salted broth. She returned the pot that evening, just as spotless as when she'd taken it. Perhaps cleaner, perhaps better kept than many would have bothered. But even the softest theft, if theft it was to be called, leaves an echo. The neighbor noticed. Word spread. And the pot, that once neutral household object, now had a story attached to it. A quiet, troubling story about trust and boundaries and the fine line between need and nerve. What followed was not a trial, not a formal punishment, but something quieter, more permanent. A reputation began to gather around her like a fog. Women who once passed her a bundle of herbs with a smile now avoided her eyes. The baker's wife, who once lingered at her gate, now turned away. Children stopped bringing her scraps of apple in exchange for stories. The blacksmith's apprentice refused to sharpen her sickle. She was not accused, not out loud. But the pot had become her name. To understand this slow undoing, one must first understand the tight weave of medieval village life. These communities functioned like extended families. Everyone knew who planted early, who milked late, who shouted when they drank, who mumbled when they lied. Property was more than ownership. It was proof of station, of permission, of being part of the invisible pact that bound the village together. Iron, in particular, held weight. It was not easily come by. An iron cooking pot might be passed down for 3 generations. If cracked, it was patched. If lost, it was mourned. And so, even a short absence, without agreement, became a kind of unspoken violence, small but lasting. The woman tried to explain, at first. She told one neighbor she had meant no harm, told another she hadn't thought it would matter, but each repetition made it worse. Her story, even when honest, began to sound like excuse. And so she grew quieter. She tended her garden more often, lingered longer near the hedgerows, kept her hands folded when others were gathering water. No one accused her again, but no one forgot. She was allowed to live, to harvest, to eat, but never again to borrow. Not even a candle stub. Not even a pinch of salt. It is easy, from our modern distance, to view this as cruel or exaggerated. But trust was survival in such times. A village could starve or thrive based not on coin, but on cooperation. And so the currency of a community was not just grain or goods, but character. One misstep, one breach of custom, especially by a woman alone, was enough to unsettle the balance. She died many years later, quietly as she had lived. Her home was cleaned out by distant relatives, the few possessions she had either passed on or buried with her. No one remembered her favorite flower or the lullabies she once sang while tending her carrots. But the story of the pot lingered, less as a tale of theft and more as a caution. A reminder of what silence could cost, of what forgetting the ritual of asking could mean. Across Europe, countless similar unwritten rules governed daily life. In some regions, borrowing was done with tokens left behind, a ribbon, a stone, a feather, to signify intent and maintain balance. In others, communal tools were kept in shared sheds, but required a verbal declaration before use. To violate these unwritten codes was to be marked, often without recourse. While elites wrote laws on parchment and carved edicts in stone, the poor lived by codes passed mouth to mouth, generation to generation. These codes were no less powerful for being invisible. In fact, they may have been more so. So imagine yourself walking down a village path at dusk, past a dozen small houses, each with their own pots steaming over a fire. You'd hear spoons tapping rims, smell garlic and turnip, and perhaps catch the muffled hum of a cradle song. And somewhere among those homes, a woman would be boiling her meal in silence, in a pot she dared never borrow again. That was her punishment. Not jail, not fine, just the slow erosion of trust. A kind of social exile measured not in distance, but in absence. Not in what was taken, but in what would never again be offered. And history, too, offered her nothing more than this quiet footnote. A borrowed pot, a spotless return, and a reputation that never healed. The farmer who cut grass beyond his allotment boundary, Imagine yourself in a small medieval village where fields roll gently under a slow-moving sky, and the wind smells of hay, sweat, and sheep's wool. The land is patchworked, each plot hemmed in by low, irregular stones and tufts of hedgerow, barely waist-high. Some borders were laid in haste, others generations ago, when land was first measured by the reach of a plowman's stride. These lines may have been crooked, but they were sacred, understood more by memory and custom than by law. Now picture a farmer. His name is not recorded in any great document, but let's call him Aldrich. He was not wealthy, nor particularly poor, simply one of many who rose with the sun and laid down only when the chores were done. Aldrich's land sat along the eastern edge of the village allotments, his rows of barley and hay stretching out beneath the mild gaze of a watchful hill. Each spring, as the rains gave way to long daylight, Aldrich would mend his fence posts, sharpen his sickle, and walk the edge of his field with slow, deliberate steps. And each year, he noted the encroachment of grasses from his neighbor's side, just a little more, leaning, growing, inviting. It was a fine line, that border. Not marked with carved stone, nor surveyed with any accuracy. Just a shared understanding. Yours begins here, mine ends there. One year, perhaps weary from a hard season or eager to bring in just a little more hay, Aldrich let his sickle swing an inch too far. One footstep beyond the customary line. Just one. The swish of the blade was the same. The sun rose the same way. No cries were heard, no protest shouted in the field. Just the rhythmic slicing of tall grass being folded into bundles, tied, and carted home. But boundaries, once questioned, rarely rest. His neighbor, let's say Osbert, had watched. Not at first. But later that evening, as Aldrich's cart rolled back through the village square, Osbert looked across the hill and said something to a friend, quiet but sharp. "That's my grass." The words drifted. They passed through the bakery queue, whispered at the well, and settled in ears like seeds. The local reeve, who tended disputes as a shepherd does his flock, was summoned, not in anger, but in that cool, procedural way of medieval village life. It was not a matter of violence, nor of theft in the dramatic sense. Just an encroachment. A question of feet and inches. But in an age when most people survived by the labor of their hands and the yield of their fields, even a foot of hay could become a wound that never healed. The judgment, when it came, was not overly cruel. Aldrich was allowed to keep most of his harvest. But not all. A portion, the hay from the disputed strip, was confiscated and redistributed. Not to Osbert, but to the village tithe barn. This served two purposes. It prevented Osbert from appearing greedy, and it reminded Aldrich that the land did not belong to the boldest blade, but to the custom of the village. Yet even after the hay had browned in storage and been fed to the parish oxen, the boundary never quite disappeared from memory. Neighbors became watchful. Children were told cautionary tales. Don't cut past the stone like Aldrich did. At midsummer feasts, laughter would halt a second too long when Aldrich passed by. Not because of hatred, but because history in a village is measured by behavior, not by parchment. These were times when maps were drawn by hand, and land passed down not always in legal documents but through shared understanding and public witnessing. Mistakes, intentional or not, became moral tales. And a man's character was bound up in the shape of his hedges and the way he walked his rows. A good farmer respected the invisible lines as much as the visible ones. Still, life went on. Aldrich sowed and reaped in the seasons that followed. He greeted Osbert when necessary, though the words never reached warmth again. Their sons played separately, and their daughters fetched water in silence. But it never flared into feud. It simply lingered, like a knot in wood or a dull ache in the joints. Across medieval England, such events were not uncommon. Disputes over land were second only to disputes over inheritance. And while great castles may have shifted hands through siege or marriage, most land was argued over in footpaths and meadows, places too small to fight for, yet too important to forget. A strip of grass could feed a sheep through winter. It could mean the difference between selling wool at market or going without meat for Lent. You can still find these boundaries today in parts of the English countryside. Long-abandoned allotments marked by crooked stones, ancient hedgerows, or ditches barely visible unless the sun is just right. They tell stories, quiet ones, of agreements whispered between neighbors, of mistakes never admitted, of tiny moments that shaped the rhythm of rural life. So, the next time you pass a low stone wall, nearly buried in grass, imagine Aldrich. Imagine a sickle in motion, a choice made under the summer sun, and the long years of silence that followed. Not all history is loud. Some of it lies folded in fields, in the distance between two men's pride, and in the quiet that follows a single misplaced step. The weaver who wove after the bells tolled midnight. Imagine yourself in a quiet medieval town, long after the day's noise has hushed into silence. The cobbled lanes are empty, shutters drawn tight against the wind, and only the occasional flicker of firelight from a hearth betrays signs of life. It is a world shaped by rhythm, of bells, of sun and moon, of labor and prayer. And in this world, curfew was not just a suggestion. It was law. At the heart of one such town, in a cramped upper chamber above a wool merchant's shop, sat a weaver. His fingers moved mechanically, almost without thought, the shuttle flying back and forth across the loom in practiced rhythm. The cloth was nearly finished, its pattern repeating in faded reds and softened grays. Outside, the church bell had already tolled midnight, its sound distant and low, swallowed quickly by the heavy air. But he kept weaving. In most towns of late medieval Europe, particularly those governed by strong guild systems, curfews were more than just safety measures. They were forms of control. Bells marked the transition between permitted activity and enforced stillness. After the final toll, shutters must be closed, tools set aside, and streets emptied. Even light spilling from a window could draw suspicion. Yet, here was the weaver, his name lost to us now, perhaps never written down at all, defying that quiet order not with anger or rebellion, but with thread. It was not ambition that led him to work past the bell, but necessity. He was behind on a commissioned bolt of cloth, and if it wasn't ready by sunrise, the merchant would cancel payment. That payment was not merely income, it was bread, rent, and dignity. To understand the weight of his decision, you must first understand the place of weaving in the medieval economy. In cities like Bruges, York, or Florence, cloth was more than commodity, it was the backbone of trade. Weavers were not mere laborers but skilled artisans bound by strict guild rules. These rules governed everything from the width of the cloth to the hours it could be made. They offered protection, yes, but also surveillance. Guild curfews were rooted in both religious doctrine and economic regulation. The church emphasized rest and spiritual reflection, particularly at night, while the guilds feared that overproduction or poorly lit weaving would lower the quality of goods and thus, the standing of their trade. A cloth made in the dark risked a crooked weave, and a crooked weave risked a merchant's anger. Discipline, not productivity, was the higher virtue. The weaver, like many artisans, knew these rules well. He had apprenticed for years, likely beginning in boyhood, rising before dawn to sweep his master's floor, oil the loom, and run errands. Only after years of quiet diligence could he earn the right to operate his own workshop. But that right came with limits. What led him to break them on that night was likely simple: a delivery deadline, a sick child, a rent collector's threat. The rhythm of his life, so often dictated by bell and guild, was momentarily overridden by the quiet panic of survival. And yet, someone noticed. It may have been a flicker of candlelight beneath the shutters, or the faint, regular thump of the loom's beater, steady and unmistakable in a sleeping street. A neighbor might have passed word to the beadle, or a rival artisan, jealous or wary, reported the infraction. When the authorities came, they would not have burst in with torches or swords. That wasn't their way. Instead, the weaver would have been summoned before his guild, likely held in a chilly stone hall lined with benches worn smooth by anxious bodies. There, his crime would be read aloud, weaving after curfew. A minor offense, perhaps, but one that spoke to disorder. The fine would be substantial, possibly more than he could pay. Guilds had the power to ban members from work, revoke licenses, even strip one of the right to hire apprentices or own tools. For our weaver, the punishment was not a cell or stocks, but something quieter. He was demoted. forbidden from operating his own workshop, forced to labor in another man's space, under another man's rules. And that, in a medieval town, was a kind of exile. His name no longer appeared in guild records. His clients disappeared. Perhaps even his neighbors grew cold. The loom that once answered only to his hand now ticked at another's pace. The irony was cruel. For a few hours of forbidden labor, done not in greed but in obligation, he lost the very autonomy that labor was meant to preserve. But his case was not unique. In towns across Europe, artisans walked this narrow path between craft and compliance. In Ghent, a candlemaker was fined for working before dawn. In Norwich, a baker was punished for firing his oven too early. And in Lübeck, a shoemaker was accused of stitching by moonlight. All across the continent, the line between necessity and defiance was thin, and the bells that tolled each night reminded everyone where that line was drawn. Still, one wonders, after that night, did the weaver ever return to his loom in solitude? Did his hands still trace the memory of motion even in stillness? Perhaps, years later, he taught an apprentice not just the craft, but the quiet price of misstep. Perhaps he remained silent when a neighbor worked too long. Or perhaps he, too, passed a name to the guild one winter evening, as hunger gnawed and old bitterness lingered. In the records he is gone. But the cloth he wove, finished or not, may have outlived him. Sewn into a tunic, sold at a market, wrapped around a child. Its threads bore no mark of curfew, no label of guilt. Only pattern, only skill, only the quiet resistance of a man who worked by candlelight after the world had gone still. And now, as you let this story settle, imagine again the sound of that loom, the steady wooden tap, the brush of wool beneath calloused fingers, the hush of breath in the dark. A rhythm broken by rule, but remembered in silence. The servant who fed scraps to a begging dog. Imagine a quiet back courtyard behind a large medieval household. The air is heavy with the scent of boiled barley, smoke from the hearth, and the sharp tang of vinegar used to scrub the floors. Somewhere beyond the wooden gate, a market bell tolls in the distance. But here, near the kitchen door, the only sound is the soft scraping of a wooden spoon on a pot, and the gentle whimper of a dog, thin, cautious, and waiting. The dog doesn't bark. It has learned not to. Its ribs show through a coat matted with dust and summer flies. Its eyes, though tired, still hold the look of hope. Not for affection, but for food. And at this moment, a servant girl notices. She is young, perhaps no more than 16, with sleeves rolled up and cheeks flushed from the fire. She's been stirring porridge since before dawn. Her tasks are endless: chopping, boiling, wiping, lifting, fetching. But for this moment, just a moment, she pauses. She glances behind her, then tears a small piece of crust from a loaf, hard and overlooked, and slips it through the open door, where the dog waits in silence. The piece vanishes in a blink, and the dog's tail wags once, softly, like a whispered thank you. But the kitchen door swings wider. A shadow passes behind her. She does not notice, until later. In many grand houses of the late medieval and early modern period, discipline among servants was a finely tuned machine. Hierarchy was enforced not just between masters and staff, but within the servant class itself. Rules were often unwritten but strictly understood. And among these many invisible lines, one stood firm: animals, especially strays, were not to be fed. To feed a dog, even a hungry one, was seen as a breach of order. The dog was not property. It had no place in the house's chain of belonging. To feed it, especially without permission, was not viewed as compassion. It was seen as waste. Waste of the household's resources. Waste of food that could be stretched another day. Waste of discipline, for if one servant fed a stray, others might follow. The young woman likely knew this. But hunger recognizes hunger. And in that moment, something human overcame something trained. When her act was discovered, it was not met with a scene. There was no shouting in the hall. No thrown ladle. Her master's anger was quiet, the kind that seeps, not explodes. A single phrase, perhaps, muttered during supper. A note passed to the steward. Her name entered into the household book with a thin line drawn through it. Dismissal came quickly, with few words. No reference was given. No payment owed. But worse than losing the job was what came next. Word spread. In tight-knit servant networks, where maids and porters and cooks moved from one household to another, the smallest offenses grew large in the retelling. A servant who broke a jug might be forgiven. One who stole, even, might find work again if the theft was clever. But one who fed animals? That whispered of softness, of disobedience, of someone who might give away more than food. Within weeks, she found herself turned away at 3 kitchens. At the 4th, they did not even ask her name, just glanced once at her shoes and her silence, and sent her on. There were no laws protecting household servants from these reputational exiles. A master's displeasure, especially from a wealthy home, was a permanent stain. And with each door closed to her, the girl's choices narrowed. It's worth pausing here to reflect on the structure of domestic labor at the time. Households were not just places to work. They were homes, systems, miniature kingdoms. Servants often lived where they labored. Their food, shelter, clothing, and even sleep depended on the goodwill of those above them. A dismissal meant more than a lost wage. It meant sudden displacement from every comfort, every belonging. It meant walking away not just from a kitchen, but from a roof, a blanket, a plate. So a single act of feeding, a crust to a creature, became, in effect, the start of social disappearance. What happened to her afterward is not recorded. Like most of the working poor, her life left few marks on parchment. She may have found a poorer household less concerned with rules. She may have drifted toward a convent seeking shelter. She may have begged. Or, perhaps, she walked past that same dog weeks later, still thin, and they looked at one another with shared understanding. 2 creatures once briefly warmed by kindness, now cold again. The dog, like her, remains unnamed in the record. Yet they both lived inside the same logic, that generosity without permission was disobedience, and obedience without question was the highest virtue. In some places and eras, certain exceptions were made. A house with children might tolerate a kitchen cat. A small manor with a kindly mistress might feed the occasional stray. But these were not rules. They were the whims of those in power. And the whims could change with the season. The servant's story is not a tragedy in the dramatic sense. There was no fire, no betrayal, no cruel spectacle. Just quiet loss. And in this quiet, we find the broader truth of so many lives lost to history, not because they were unimportant, but because their dignity was chipped away in small, invisible acts. You might be wondering, why remember this? Because history is not only made of kings and laws, but of choices like hers. A crust shared, a rule broken, a life changed. These moments, though small, echo the same questions we still ask today. Who gets to show kindness? Who decides what compassion costs? And who, in the end, is punished for mercy? As the fire in the kitchen dies down, and the footsteps of masters fade upstairs, a cool draft moves through the open door. The dog has long gone. The girl is no longer there. But in that space between hunger and hope, something lingers. A brief, human defiance. Quiet, but not forgotten. The mason who left his tools in a sacred aisle. Imagine a space half filled with light, half filled with dust. A stone chapel still under construction. Its walls hum faintly with chisel marks, unfinished prayers carved into pale limestone. The air is thick with centuries of labor, but also with silence. This is not yet a holy place, but soon it will be. In medieval Europe, few spaces were as symbolically loaded as the interior of a church, even during construction. Long before the roof was in place or the altar raised, certain areas of the building were already considered sacred, set apart. These were not just structures. They were meant to be vessels for the divine. And to build them was not just labor, it was devotion. The mason in question was likely an ordinary man by outward measure. Hands calloused from stonework, clothes simple, coated with fine dust that clung like a second skin. He rose before sunrise, walked to the worksite as bells rang from a nearby priory tower, and worked beside other craftsmen beneath scaffolds and pulleys made from rope and timber. His tools were few but precious. A chisel, a trowel, a compass, and a mallet of seasoned wood worn to the grip of his palm. On this particular morning, perhaps his thoughts drifted. A child's illness, a missed tithe, a neighbor's harsh glance. Or maybe he was simply tired. The work was heavy, repetitive, and slow. Building a chapel could take years, even decades. He set his mallet down near a smooth pillar base and stepped away, thinking to return in a moment. But the moment passed. Perhaps a bell rang for midday prayer. Perhaps the overseer called him to another task. By the time he remembered, the mallet, still resting against the newly consecrated column, had already been seen. Now, to the modern mind, a misplaced tool seems a trivial mistake. But in that time and place, the chapel's layout was mapped not just in measurements but in theology. Some parts were sacred before they were finished. The nave, the chancel, the aisle near the future altar, these were not mere architectural zones. They were gradients of holiness. A consecrated pillar, even before the full building was closed in, was considered touched by God. To leave a tool there, especially one that might be stained with sweat or clay, even unintentionally, was a kind of symbolic stain. Not quite a crime, but not far from one either. The act was labeled irreverent, and in certain communities, such acts were treated with the same gravity as theft or slander. The mason's error was reported, perhaps by a steward tasked with overseeing the construction's purity, or by a visiting priest who happened upon the scene. It is unlikely that the mason argued. He knew the weight of such symbols. To defend himself might be to deepen the perceived disrespect. So he was fined, a penalty not measured only in coin, but in standing. Monetary fines in such cases could be harsh, even disproportionate. They served less as punishment and more as public reinforcement of the sacred hierarchy. The mason's wages, already modest, were docked. His family might have tightened their belts, stretching stew with water, repairing old tunics rather than buying new wool. But the fine was only the beginning. Public penance was the true cost. On the following Sunday, the congregation gathered. The morning was likely dim, with incense curling through the air and candlelight dancing off the unfinished stone walls. The mason did not sit among the rest. He knelt, alone, on cold flagstones in front of the assembly. His head bowed, his eyes lowered, a figure not of defiance but of contrition. There was no dramatic reading of his offense, no sermon pointing fingers, but his presence was its own message, a reminder that the sacred required constant care and that no one, not even its builders, was above reproach. He knelt there through the entire service, perhaps longer, his knees pressing into stone, his presence visible to all, yet not quite acknowledged. Some may have pitied him, others may have nodded quietly, approving the order of things. In time, the moment passed. The congregation filed out. The mason stood, his legs numb, and returned to his work site. He continued to shape stones, align angles, and smooth mortar. But something had changed. His presence near the consecrated aisle would now be watched more closely. His steps perhaps a little more careful. His mind never fully away from where he left that mallet. And yet, despite the severity, there is something tender about this story. It reveals a world where the physical and spiritual could not be separated. A hammer was not just a tool. A pillar was not just a column. To build was to serve. To misstep was not just to break a rule. It was to disturb a balance. Today, the chapel may still stand. Tourists may pass beneath its arches unaware. They might marvel at the carvings, the quiet acoustics, the way light filters through stained glass added centuries later. But they won't know of the mason's mallet. They won't remember the penance offered in dust and silence. Still, the story lingers. Not in stone, but in the quiet records of village memory. The lesson whispered not in words, but in ritual, that in a world shaped by belief, even the smallest act, setting something down and walking away, could ripple through the sacred. And now, if you picture that chapel again, half-built, quiet, gray with fine powder, try to hear the echo of a wooden mallet landing softly against stone. Not with defiance, but with care. As if the very act of building were a form of prayer. The girl who plucked a single bloom from the abbey garden. Imagine a walled garden, hidden behind thick limestone cloisters, where the air hangs heavy with the scent of damp herbs and flowering rosemary. The gravel paths are swept clean each morning, their edges lined with carefully trained boxwood. Everything here grows under order, fig trees held to precise shapes, lavender trimmed before full bloom, violets planted to catch the filtered sun as it slides through the narrow slats of monastery stone. This is not a wild garden. It is a sacred one. In such a place, silence matters. The garden is tended not just for beauty, but as a form of devotion. Every bloom is a small, living psalm. And yet, it was here, in this careful stillness, that a young girl reached out her hand and broke a rule she didn't yet understand. She was no more than 12. Her name has vanished, as girls' names often do in the footnotes of the past. But we know she came from the village just beyond the abbey walls, a place where the wind rustled through unpruned hedges and the smell of sheep clung to clothes. Her mother may have worked in the abbey kitchens, or perhaps she delivered eggs to the side door. However it began, the girl was permitted inside the gates, an act of trust, small but significant. She had been warned, likely with a soft voice and a firm glance, "Do not touch anything in the garden. It is for the sisters." But something about that flower caught her. A rare thing. A foreign bloom planted by the herbal mistress from distant seeds. It had tall, waxy petals the color of rust and smoke, and it bent gently in the breeze as if bowing. The girl had never seen a flower like that. And so, without planning, without malice, she reached out and snapped its stem. In that moment, the garden changed. Not for her alone, but for the watching eyes behind the abbey shutters, for the novices in brown habits who had tended the flower beds with prayer and pruning knives. The silence shattered not with sound, but with broken trust. The punishment came not as anger, but as structure. A quiet sentence handed down in the same tone as a scripture reading. She would not be whipped. That was for harsher crimes. But she would work. The abbey's fields needed weeding. The soil was dry, the thistles persistent, the sun indifferent. Her small hands, meant for thread or chalk or bread dough, would now bleed on nettles and clutch fistfuls of root. She was given no gloves. None were offered. And so she rose each morning before the second bell and walked the long corridor to the edge of the cultivated land, where rows of onions, cabbages, and medicinal herbs waited in obedient lines. Her feet sank into mud. Her fingers swelled with sting. And all the while, the abbey garden remained locked, its gate gently closed, as if to remind her that beauty, once violated, retreats. This was not cruelty. At least, not as the abbey saw it. It was correction. A girl who could not distinguish between what was beautiful and what was sacred needed to learn through labor. That was the thinking of the time. And in many ways, it reflected the wider world beyond those cloisters. Medieval life revolved around boundaries. There were boundaries of class, of gender, of property, and of silence. Gardens, especially those within abbeys, symbolized not only fertility and healing, but order. They were reflections of divine structure, where each plant had a purpose and each petal a place. To pluck one without permission was to disturb more than a flower bed. It was to ignore hierarchy. For women and girls, especially, obedience was a currency. There were so few tools available for navigating the narrow corridors of medieval life that to defy, even gently, was to risk being locked out of favor. A single act could stain a lifetime of good behavior. And yet, gardens were also spaces of contradiction. They grew things meant to be admired. They lured with scent and color. They invited wonder. The flower that girl picked may well have been bred for healing. It may have been a specimen of exotic use. Or it may simply have been beautiful in a way that asked for reverence. But reverence was not the same as possession. By the time her punishment ended, 5 days, perhaps 6, her hands were marked. Not permanently, but enough that her touch grew slower, her glances more cautious. She resumed her visits to the abbey, if they still allowed her. She may have helped in the kitchens again, or stitched linen in the quiet workshop near the scriptorium. The garden gate, over time, reopened. But she never reached inside it again. The flower, of course, never regrew. Its root system had been too shallow, too young to survive the stem's removal. The sisters did not replace it. Instead, the empty patch was covered with sage and marjoram, practical plants, modest ones, unlikely to tempt. History never wrote her name, but her lesson was written into the rhythm of her days. And through her, we glimpse the fine line between wonder and transgression, a line often drawn more sharply for the powerless. In time, she would have become a woman. Perhaps she married a miller or tended goats on a distant hill. Perhaps she joined the sisters after all, choosing the quiet over the noise of the village. Or perhaps she left, carrying with her a story she only whispered at night, to daughters or nieces or no one at all. But somewhere in the folds of time, that single plucked flower still echoes. A small act, a brief mistake. And yet, in the tightly ordered world of sacred walls and cloistered gardens, even innocence came at a price. The merchant who sold a measure slightly underweight. Imagine yourself standing in a narrow medieval marketplace just as the day begins. The sun has not fully cleared the rooftops, and a thin mist clings to the cobbles. There is a quiet here, not silence, but the soft sound of shutters opening, of cartwheels creaking, and of merchants clearing their throats before calling out their wares. This was the rhythm of commerce in countless towns across Europe, a pattern as familiar as the turning of the seasons. Among these merchants stood a man named Edric. He was not wealthy, but neither was he desperate. His stall was modest, canvas stretched over worn beams, protecting sacks of grain from the damp. Wheat, rye, and barley were his livelihood. His scales, made of iron and wood, had been passed down from his father. Their chains were dulled with age, the pans slightly unlevel from years of shifting weight and weather. But they had served him well. For Edric, each morning followed the same pattern. He would check his stock, light his lantern if the day was overcast, and place the familiar iron weights beside the scale. Customers came with small cloth bags or wooden bowls. A measure of rye for pottage, a few handfuls of wheat for baking, or barley to feed a sickly mule. Trade was personal, conducted with nods and murmurs more than contracts and coins. But fairness was everything. A merchant's reputation was measured not only in the quality of his goods, but in the trust he inspired. In an era when few could read and fewer still could measure with precision, a buyer had to believe in the weight of the scoop and the honesty of the hand behind it. So when the inspector came, it wasn't with fanfare. He arrived quietly, under the pretense of purchase. His own weights were hidden in his satchel, carefully calibrated by the town reeve. When Edric measured out a standard portion, the inspector tilted his head, not in anger, not in accusation, but in the cold, practiced way of someone noting a misalignment. The grain was short, just slightly, no more than a thumb's worth in a full sack. Edric watched, confused, as the inspector pulled out his reference weights. Adjustments were made. The scale tipped unevenly. A note was made on a small parchment sheet. And just like that, the stall was marked. A seal was pressed into warm wax and affixed to the table's edge. Trade was to cease until the matter could be reviewed. To Edric, it felt like the ground had shifted beneath him. He had not intended deceit. The imbalance was likely the result of a worn pin or a warped beam, bent slightly in last winter's freeze. But intent mattered little. In the eyes of the guild, fairness was not only a principle, it was a structure that had to be visibly upheld. A warning to others. The punishment was swift. A fine equivalent to several weeks' earnings and the suspension of his license to trade in the square. His stall stood empty for days, covered with a cloth, while neighbors glanced sidelong and whispered. Some pitied him. Others shrugged, assuming guilt. In a town like this, silence and suspicion often arrived hand in hand. This wasn't unique to Edric. Across medieval Europe, regulations surrounding weights and measures were a constant presence. Markets were overseen by officials who carried standard units, iron weights stamped with symbols of the crown or local lord. These officials had the authority to confiscate goods, shut down stalls, and impose harsh penalties. For repeat offenses, the punishment could escalate, sometimes as far as stocks or even public shame. It might seem harsh for such a small infraction, but these systems were rooted in centuries of growing mistrust. Before standardization, buyers were routinely cheated by inconsistent measures. One town's quart might be another's pint. A bushel might vary from stall to stall, depending on how it was heaped or leveled. The creation of shared units was as much a moral commitment as it was an economic reform. And so, even when a man like Edric erred by the slimmest margin, he threatened the delicate scaffolding of trust that held the entire market together. It wasn't just about a few grains. It was about the invisible contract between buyer and seller and the integrity of commerce itself. For Edric, the months that followed were difficult. He paid the fine with borrowed coin. He replaced the balance bar on his scale, sanding it carefully to level. When he returned to the market, he did so humbly, speaking little. Business returned slowly. Regulars came back first, testing his measure with careful eyes. He weighed extra at first, giving just a little more, to restore their confidence. Eventually, the whispers faded. Other dramas took their place. A baker accused of watering his dough. A weaver fined for selling cloth an inch too short. In the village's collective memory, Edric's mismeasure became just another footnote in a long history of minor transgressions. But if you had asked him years later, as he packed up his stall near dusk, he might have still looked at his scale with quiet unease. Not fear, not guilt, just the knowledge that even in the smallest of errors, a man's world could tilt unexpectedly, and that sometimes the weight of honesty was heavier than grain. The child who doodled on a tax record scroll. Imagine a room where the air smells faintly of candle wax and old ink. A low fire burns in the hearth, and the sound of quills scratching against parchment echoes softly through wooden beams. This is not a place of storytelling or study. It is a place of numbers, of taxes, of quietly accumulated power. It is a clerk's office in a medieval town, unremarkable to most, but vital to the life of the community. Here, names are listed beside obligations. Tithes, tolls, rents, and dues. This is where debts are recorded and made real. On one such day, a mother stepped into the room holding her child by the hand. Perhaps she was there to resolve an error in a record, or to plead leniency for a late payment. The boy, no older than 6 or 7, was not meant to be there. But childcare was not a service most towns offered. And so he came with her. The room must have seemed curious to him. Tall rolls of parchment carefully stored in slots, cabinets with tiny labeled drawers, the low creak of stools as men leaned over tables. He may have been instructed to sit quietly in the corner, to touch nothing, to wait. But boredom and ink are a dangerous combination. While his mother conferred with a clerk, perhaps distracted or anxious, the boy reached for a scroll that had been partially unrolled at the edge of a desk. Its margin was wide and blank, a tempting space to a restless hand. He dipped a quill, perhaps one already wet, and began to draw. Not a masterpiece, just a doodle, a child's idle sketch. Perhaps a crude house, a smiling face, a bird with too many wings. The lines were likely quick and uneven, the ink dark and thin, and soon it ran. The scroll absorbed it instantly. The image bled into the margin, then into the rows of names and tallies that lined the parchment like ribs. The drawing was not on its own page. It had trespassed onto a live document, one of the town's official account rolls. In the eyes of a medieval clerk, this was not mischief. It was defacement. These records were not merely administrative. They were legally binding. An account roll was not just paper, it was proof. It told the story of who owed what to whom. And these documents were costly. Calfskin parchment was not cheap, nor easily replaced. A single scroll might contain months of compiled dues, written in careful, consistent script. When the ink smudged across several lines, the effect was permanent. There was no undoing it, no gently blotting away the child's error. The damage was interpreted not as innocent, but intentional. The clerk reported the incident to the council. The council deliberated, and judgment was swift. A fine was levied. It was not small. Medieval penalties often weren't, especially when they involved communal property. Even accidental damage could be treated harshly when it affected tax records. The assumption was simple: if the child had been better supervised, this wouldn't have happened. Responsibility fell not on the child, but on the parent. The mother may have pleaded, explained, apologized. But in a world where paper was law, apologies rarely mattered. The fine exceeded her ability to pay. And so, the family left. Leaving town was, in many cases, the only option for those without means. fines that couldn't be paid led to loss of property or imprisonment. For many families on the edge of poverty, relocation was the only recourse. But leaving a town in the Middle Ages was not like moving today. It meant severing ties, economic, social, and protective. Guild memberships did not transfer. Licenses to sell goods or rent land did not follow. Leaving often meant starting over as a stranger somewhere new. And all because of a drawing. To modern eyes, the punishment seems disproportionate, but the medieval mind viewed order as fragile. The written record was sacred, not spiritually, but structurally. It was what allowed feudal obligations to function, debts to be enforced, and communities to track their own subsistence. And these offices, dim, dusty, quiet, were the arteries of that system. Children were rarely welcomed in such places. Their noise, their unpredictability, their tendency to mark, tear, or spill, all were perceived as threats to the careful arrangement of ink and parchment. There are scattered mentions in town records across England, France, and the Low Countries of similar incidents: spilled inkwells, torn folios, margins blackened by soot. In some cases, fines were reduced. In others, they were not. Sometimes, the name of the child was never recorded. Only the mother's. And in most cases, the records note the punishment, not the aftermath. We do not know where this family went. Whether they found another town, another trade, another chance. It's possible the mother had family elsewhere. Or that the child grew up remembering only that one smudged scroll. That one moment of quiet doodling that changed everything. What we do know is this. In a time when paper ruled lives, even a child's idle hand could be judged with the full weight of the law. And in towns where the margins of documents held no space for forgiveness, ink could be a sentence. So now, as you picture the gentle flicker of a clerk's candle, the slow unrolling of parchment, and the soft scrape of quill on skin, imagine also a child's fingertip, stained with ink, reaching toward a scroll he cannot read, and the long, quiet consequence that followed. The baker who raised prices on a festival day. Imagine a morning wrapped in soft fog, the kind that clings to rooftops and rolls gently down cobbled streets. The village is unusually lively today. Bells ring out from the church tower in rhythmic waves, calling the faithful to Mass. Women gather in the market square with wreaths of flowers, children tug at sleeves, and the smell of roasting meats drifts faintly on the breeze. It is a feast day, a holy celebration. Not a common one, but one marked in red on the church calendar, when fasting gives way to feasting, and even the poorest hope for something warm in their hands. The baker has been up since long before dawn. His fingers are dusted white with flour, his sleeves stiff with yesterday's dough. Inside his shop, the ovens roar, fed with wood stacked carefully the week before. Rows of bread, round, crisped at the edges, line the wooden shelves. The smell is thick, comforting, yeasty, and alive. Today, the villagers will want more than usual. Not the hard heel of day-old rye or coarse barley loaves, but fresh white bread, rare and soft. And so, the baker does what feels natural. He adds a single penny to the price. Just one. A loaf that cost 2 pence now costs 3. Nothing more. But this tiny shift, this single coin, sets in motion a quiet storm. In many medieval towns, especially those governed by charters or under manorial law, the price of bread was not simply a matter of supply and demand. It was regulated, sometimes fiercely so, by local officials who enforced what was called the assize of bread. This long-standing tradition, in place since at least the 13th century in England and mirrored in many regions across Europe, fixed the price of a loaf based on the cost of wheat, with strict punishments for deviation. The reason was simple: bread was life. For most people, it made up the bulk of every meal. To raise its price, even by a penny, was seen not merely as opportunism, but as endangerment. It struck at the heart of subsistence. On feast days, when workers spent their extra coins and children looked forward to a proper meal, any increase felt like betrayal. The baker, perhaps, thought little of it. The demand was high. His costs, too, had grown. Firewood was scarce that month. His apprentice had fallen ill. The flour sacks had come in lighter than promised. A penny seemed justifiable. But by mid-morning, whispers began. A woman with 3 children complained she could afford only 2 loaves instead of 3. An old man muttered that he remembered fairer prices. A clerk from the guild passed by and took note. And within hours, the baker was summoned to the town hall. It was not a trial, not exactly, but it felt like one. Local officials inspected his weights. They measured the loaves. They checked the prices on his tally board. And though the bread itself was sound, well-baked, well-measured, the extra penny was enough. The penalty came swiftly. His ovens were seized, locked, bricked, or taken apart depending on local custom. His tools, peels, troughs, paddles were removed. In some places, a black mark was painted on the door, a quiet symbol of disgrace. In others, his name was simply struck from the baker's register, a silent removal from public trust. He was forbidden to bake. Without an oven, a baker is nothing. His trade, like his warmth, vanishes. And with it, his income. His family, once fed by the labor of flour and fire, now faced scarcity. Not for stealing, not for sickness, but for charging 1 penny too many on a sacred day. The community did not weep for him. To them, he had broken trust. The regulations around bread were designed not only to ensure fairness but to maintain the illusion of stability in uncertain times. When harvests failed or wars loomed or plague whispered through the alleys, the one constant people clung to was bread. And those who tampered with that constant were viewed not as tradesmen, but as threats. It is easy, from a distance, to see the penalty as harsh. After all, the baker did not dilute the dough or bake it poorly. He did not cheat the scales or poison the flour. He simply responded to a market that was momentarily willing to pay more. But medieval economies were not free markets. They were tightly choreographed systems, balancing scarcity, tradition, and the perceived morality of trade. To profit from hunger, especially during a festival meant to honor the divine, was treated as a moral failure. Still, not all such stories ended in ruin. In some cases, a baker might petition for reinstatement months later, promising never to raise prices again. If he had friends in the guild, or if the village needed bread badly enough, he might be allowed to return to his trade, but not always. Some never baked again. Their families might turn to other work, brewing if they had a copper pot, or mending if they had spare cloth. Some moved to another town. Some faded into records only as names struck through by an official hand. Today, when we see bread wrapped neatly in cellophane and stacked on shelves by the dozen, it's easy to forget that once, a single loaf could be a symbol of trust. That behind every price was a rule. And behind every rule, a fear that if fairness slipped, even slightly, the whole fragile order might follow. So the story of the baker who raised his price by a penny is not about greed in the modern sense. It is about how thin the line was between honest trade and social betrayal. How tightly survival was managed, how little room there was to stray. As you drift now into quiet thought, imagine again the warm brick oven, the soft weight of rising dough, the hands that shaped it, and the mistake that closed the door. The fire inside cooled, the bench beside it empty, and somewhere beyond the shuttered window, a festival carried on, full of music and laughter, but without his bread on the table. The bread was warm, the price too high, and history, as always, was unforgiving, quiet, but not forgotten. The baker who raised prices on a festival day. Imagine a morning wrapped in soft fog, the kind that clings to rooftops and rolls gently down cobbled streets. The village is unusually lively today. Bells ring out from the church tower in rhythmic waves, calling the faithful to Mass. Women gather in the market square with wreaths of flowers, children tug at sleeves, and the smell of roasting meats drifts faintly on the breeze. It is a feast day, a holy celebration. Not a common one, but one marked in red on the church calendar, when fasting gives way to feasting, and even the poorest hope for something warm in their hands. The baker has been up since long before dawn. His fingers are dusted white with flour, his sleeves stiff with yesterday's dough. Inside his shop, the ovens roar, fed with wood stacked carefully the week before. Rows of bread, round, crisped at the edges, line the wooden shelves. The smell is thick, comforting, yeasty, and alive. Today, the villagers will want more than usual. Not the hard heel of day-old rye or coarse barley loaves, but fresh white bread, rare and soft. And so, the baker does what feels natural. He adds a single penny to the price. Just one. A loaf that cost 2 pence now costs 3. Nothing more. But this tiny shift, this single coin, sets in motion a quiet storm. In many medieval towns, especially those governed by charters or under manorial law, the price of bread was not simply a matter of supply and demand. It was regulated, sometimes fiercely so, by local officials who enforced what was called the assize of bread. This long-standing tradition, in place since at least the 13th century in England and mirrored in many regions across Europe, fixed the price of a loaf based on the cost of wheat, with strict punishments for deviation. The reason was simple: bread was life. For most people, it made up the bulk of every meal. To raise its price, even by a penny, was seen not merely as opportunism, but as endangerment. It struck at the heart of subsistence. On feast days, when workers spent their extra coins and children looked forward to a proper meal, any increase felt like betrayal. The baker, perhaps, thought little of it. The demand was high. His costs, too, had grown. Firewood was scarce that month. His apprentice had fallen ill. The flour sacks had come in lighter than promised. A penny seemed justifiable. But by mid-morning, whispers began. A woman with 3 children complained she could afford only 2 loaves instead of 3. An old man muttered that he remembered fairer prices. A clerk from the guild passed by and took note. And within hours, the baker was summoned to the town hall. It was not a trial, not exactly, but it felt like one. Local officials inspected his weights. They measured the loaves. They checked the prices on his tally board. And though the bread itself was sound, well-baked, well-measured, the extra penny was enough. The penalty came swiftly. His ovens were seized, locked, bricked, or taken apart depending on local custom. His tools, peels, troughs, paddles were removed. In some places, a black mark was painted on the door, a quiet symbol of disgrace. In others, his name was simply struck from the baker's register, a silent removal from public trust. He was forbidden to bake. Without an oven, a baker is nothing. His trade, like his warmth, vanishes. And with it, his income. His family, once fed by the labor of flour and fire, now faced scarcity. Not for stealing, not for sickness, but for charging 1 penny too many on a sacred day. The community did not weep for him. To them, he had broken trust. The regulations around bread were designed not only to ensure fairness but to maintain the illusion of stability in uncertain times. When harvests failed or wars loomed or plague whispered through the alleys, the one constant people clung to was bread. And those who tampered with that constant were viewed not as tradesmen, but as threats. It is easy, from a distance, to see the penalty as harsh. After all, the baker did not dilute the dough or bake it poorly. He did not cheat the scales or poison the flour. He simply responded to a market that was momentarily willing to pay more. But medieval economies were not free markets. They were tightly choreographed systems, balancing scarcity, tradition, and the perceived morality of trade. To profit from hunger, especially during a festival meant to honor the divine, was treated as a moral failure. Still, not all such stories ended in ruin. In some cases, a baker might petition for reinstatement months later, promising never to raise prices again. If he had friends in the guild, or if the village needed bread badly enough, he might be allowed to return to his trade, but not always. Some never baked again. Their families might turn to other work, brewing if they had a copper pot, or mending if they had spare cloth. Some moved to another town. Some faded into records only as names struck through by an official hand. Today, when we see bread wrapped neatly in cellophane and stacked on shelves by the dozen, it's easy to forget that once, a single loaf could be a symbol of trust. That behind every price was a rule. And behind every rule, a fear that if fairness slipped, even slightly, the whole fragile order might follow. So the story of the baker who raised his price by a penny is not about greed in the modern sense. It is about how thin the line was between honest trade and social betrayal. How tightly survival was managed, how little room there was to stray. As you drift now into quiet thought, imagine again the warm brick oven, the soft weight of rising dough, the hands that shaped it, and the mistake that closed the door. The fire inside cooled, the bench beside it empty, and somewhere beyond the shuttered window, a festival carried on, full of music and laughter, but without his bread on the table. The bread was warm, the price too high, and history, as always, was unforgiving, quiet, but not forgotten. The scribe who miswrote a noble's title on a decree imagined the quiet hum of a medieval scriptorium, the gentle scratch of quill on parchment, the rustle of robes, the soft clink of sand poured to dry ink. A place where silence was not only sacred, but practical. Mistakes could not be shouted away. They had to be caught before the ink set, before wax was poured and the seal pressed. For in this world of brittle vellum and unforgiving hierarchy, a single letter could upend a life. Now picture a man seated near the window, his fingers stained with walnut ink, his eyes reddened from candlelight and duty. He is a scribe, not young but not yet old, someone who has spent the better part of 2 decades turning spoken commands into written law. His task is clear: prepare the final copy of a royal decree affirming a land grant to a regional noble. The noble in question is proud, sensitive to status, and, most dangerously, well-connected. The scribe's hand moves steadily, accustomed to the shape of the words. He copies the formal phrasing in Latin, per mandatum regis, terra concessa est. He writes the noble's full title near the top, as protocol requires. But somewhere between the dip of the quill and the lift of the pen, a single letter slips. A bar forgotten, a flourish misplaced. The comes becomes canes. Count becomes dog. A respectable title transformed, almost imperceptibly, into ridicule. He does not notice. Not then. Perhaps he is tired, or perhaps the draft he copied from had a smudge. The decree is sanded, rolled, sealed with the king's emblem, and dispatched by courier before the end of the day. The ink is dry, but the consequences are not. The noble receives the parchment 3 days later. He unrolls it slowly, as nobles often do, ritual over haste. And then he reads the line. It takes only a moment. His eyes narrow. His face remains still, but something beneath it hardens. He says nothing to his steward, sends no furious letters. He merely tucks the decree away, and begins the quieter work of retribution. To those in court, the scribe's fall seems sudden. One day he is seated at his bench, entrusted with royal seals and important correspondence. The next, he is removed, quietly, efficiently, as if he had simply ceased to be needed. His possessions are boxed. His chamber is reassigned. He receives no explanation, only a notice that his services will no longer be required. The message is signed with a name he knows well, the noble he offended. This is not a story of torture, or exile, or prison. It is a story of silence. The kind of silence that descends with finality. In the complex social machinery of the medieval court, reputation was often more fragile than flesh. Once broken, it could not be mended with apologies or pleas. To understand the weight of this error, one must understand the role of the scribe. In a world where literacy was rare and documents held the force of law, a scribe was more than a copyist. He was a translator of power into permanence. His ink turned intention into consequence. One misplaced word could affect taxes, inheritance, feuds, or borders. And more than that, it could wound pride, which was sometimes even more volatile than property. Noble titles were sacred forms of identity. They reflected bloodlines, allegiances, and divine favor. A misspelled title wasn't just embarrassing, it was delegitimizing, especially if it could be interpreted as insult. In a setting where court humor ran dry and cutting, such an error might not have seemed accidental. Was it a jest? A jab? A veiled commentary? The ambiguity made it all the more dangerous. There are no surviving records of the scribe's later life. That is often the way with minor men who committed major missteps. But we can imagine what became of him. Perhaps he returned to a provincial town, offering his services to a parish church or a minor abbot. Perhaps he taught letters to a merchant's son or kept accounts for a quiet estate. Or perhaps he never wrote again. his hands steady but unwelcome. Scribes were trained from youth. They studied under clerics, learned to form letters with precision, to count syllables in Latin, to pour ink evenly, and to remain invisible. Their work was to preserve the image of perfection. To err was to shatter that image. It's worth noting that errors in manuscripts were not uncommon, but most were caught early, corrected with marginal notes, or scraped from the vellum. What made this mistake so costly was not the letter itself. It was the context, the recipient, the timing, and the public nature of the document. A lesser noble might have laughed it off. A more forgiving lord might have sent the document back, requesting correction. But this noble, who likely rose through careful positioning and guarded pride, saw in that single word a slight that could not go unpunished. And in punishing it, he reminded others of the consequences of carelessness. This is the quiet brutality of administrative life in the Middle Ages. So much power, so few chances. For every war, there were 100 ruined careers behind desks. A scribe could change a fate with a stroke, and lose his own just as quickly. And so the tale lived on, not in chronicles or court poems, but in the whispering lessons passed to younger scribes. Check twice, seal once, know your noble's name as you know your own, and never forget that ink is permanent, but favor is not. So now, imagine yourself walking through a great hall long after the court has gone quiet. There on the shelf lies a scroll, its wax seal faded, its writing still legible. The mistake is still there, quiet as a smirk. A noble, once called dog. A scribe, once trusted, now vanished. No blood was spilled. No swords were drawn. But a single pen stroke, swift and unthinking, was enough to erase a man from history. And that, too, was a kind of execution. The apprentice who lit a candle too early. Imagine a quiet medieval workshop as the sun begins to lower behind slate rooftops, its light slanting through warped glass windows in golden strips. Dust hangs in the air like fine ash, and the smell is a mixture of wax, wood shavings, and cold stone. The day's labor is drawing to a close, but not yet done. Tools are still on benches. Cloaks still hang on pegs. The master has not yet called for the shutters to be drawn. This was the hour between light and dark, neither day nor night, when candles were still forbidden, not by decree of law necessarily, but by strict custom, cost, and fear. Fire, after all, was both servant and destroyer. It warmed bread, lit scripture, and sealed wax. But it also consumed homes and lives with terrifying ease. Candles were not simply tools of convenience, they were regulated luxuries. And so we come to the boy, a young apprentice, perhaps 15, who had come to the city a year or two prior. His name may have been Tom, or perhaps Ellis. Names often fade when reputations are lost. He was one of many boys sent from distant farms to live under the roof of a tradesman, a candle maker, a scrivener, or perhaps a master of leather. He learned by watching. He swept the floor, fetched supplies, and hoped for praise. The rules of his apprenticeship were simple but strict. Never waste material. Never speak unless spoken to. And never, ever light a candle before the appointed hour, typically just after the church bells rang for Compline, when day's work was formally closed, and a single flame could be justified as necessity, not vanity. But that evening, as twilight crept too slowly for the boy's impatient hands, he struck the flint. Perhaps the parchment was hard to read. Perhaps he thought no one would notice. Perhaps, and this is likely, he simply wanted to please, hoping to finish a task before the master returned from the guild hall. The candle flared, small and bright, its scent sharp with tallow. The shadows retreated just enough for him to continue. And yet, within moments, the sound of boots in the corridors silenced his breath. The master stepped in, saw the flame, and froze. Not in fear, but in fury held tight behind his ribs. The candle sat on the workbench like a tiny rebellion. In the flickering light, the boy's face flushed with guilt, realizing too late the weight of what he had done. The punishment was swift. Not a beating, though those were common enough, but something quieter, more permanent. The guild fined the master for the violation, not because of the candle itself, but because of what it represented. A break in order, a lapse in discipline. The guild prided itself on structure, predictability, and control. Fire lit too early was not simply wasteful, it was presumptuous. It risked more than coin. It risked trust. For a master craftsman, the apprentice was not just an extra pair of hands. He was an extension of the household's name, reputation, and trade lineage. An error by the boy reflected back on the teacher. And so, with disappointment layered atop the financial penalty, the master dismissed him. Not with cruelty, not with shouting, just a cold, firm command: pack your things. Return to your village. Your learning ends here. The boy's belongings were few. A small wooden comb, a worn cloak, and perhaps a scrap of parchment he had practiced his letters on. The journey home was likely quiet, footsore, and long. He would have arrived back at his parents' threshold with no trade, no wage, and a tale he dared not fully explain. In medieval society, apprenticeships were sacred pathways out of poverty. They took years to complete, and entry was often secured through favor, coin, or both. To be dismissed early was rare and shameful. It meant not only the loss of a livelihood, but a stain that might follow a person for years. Some apprentices, once dismissed, never tried again. Others sought new masters, far from the first, hoping their names hadn't traveled. And it's worth noting, candles in this era were not like the paraffin tapers of today. They were costly. Tallow was cheap but smoky, made from animal fat. Beeswax burned cleaner but was prized and expensive. Monasteries used wax for sacred light. The wealthy used it to write letters or dine after dusk. For a poor household, a single candle could represent an hour of labor or more. Lighting one without cause was, in some eyes, akin to burning coin. This incident, though small, speaks to a larger truth of the medieval world. That discipline was woven into every action. That time, light, and labor were tightly bound together. That in a world lit mostly by sun and fire, even a flicker held power. And that an apprentice, however humble, lived at the mercy of customs often too old to question. If you walk the quiet back alleys of older European towns today, you might pass a windowless workshop still bearing iron hooks where lanterns once hung. Behind those walls, boys once leaned over benches, squinting in fading daylight, waiting for permission to strike a spark. And somewhere in that silence, you might remember the boy who lit a candle too early. Not to defy, not to destroy, but simply to see, to finish a task, to earn praise, to belong. And yet, in that single flame, he lost the only future he knew. The farmer who carried an unmarked sack of grain. Imagine a narrow dirt path threading through a patchwork of fields. The grass is low, worn thin from hooves and cartwheels, and dust rises gently with each step. It is early morning, and the mist hasn't yet lifted from the hedgerows. A man walks steadily with a sack hoisted across one shoulder, its weight shifting gently with his pace. The sack smells faintly of chaff and old burlap. Inside is barley, harvested, dried, and ready for market. The man is a tenant farmer. He has no cart, no hired hands, just the sack and the route. The path cuts across the edge of the Lord's domain, land held directly by the manor and managed under his officials' watchful eyes. Crossing it was permitted, but with rules. Always with rules. One such rule, seemingly small, was this: sacks of grain must be stamped with a seal, either pressed in wax, painted with the farmer's mark, or tied with a recognized cord. This marked the grain as properly declared, legally moved, and traceable in case of theft or fraud. On this morning, whether by haste or forgetfulness, the farmer had not marked the sack. It was just burlap. Plain, heavy, anonymous. To him, it likely meant little. He knew the grain was his. He'd sown it, harvested it, carried it. A stamped mark was, perhaps, something he'd meant to do at the barn and simply hadn't. But to the manor's reeve, the steward appointed to oversee such matters, it was a violation. Unmarked goods, especially food, triggered suspicion. Was it stolen? Meant to avoid tolls or taxes? Could it have come from a different estate, one with competing grain quotas? Grain was not simply food in the Middle Ages, it was the heartbeat of the economy. Tithes, rents, and wages were often paid in it. Laws surrounded its movement, pricing, and storage. And lords, always wary of shrinkage in their ledgers, enforced these laws with quiet precision. The reeve halted him. He might not have raised his voice. There would be no shouting. Just a gesture. A question. Whose sack is this? The farmer likely answered plainly, mine. Perhaps he explained, quickly, that he had meant to stamp it. That it had come from his own fields, less than half a mile back. But the words didn't matter as much as the missing mark. The sack was confiscated. The grain was carried away, likely not by force, but by slow, procedural authority. It would be recorded, inspected, perhaps held in the manor stores while the case was reviewed. In time, it might be ruled that the grain could not be returned, that it had entered the Lord's lands illegally and was now forfeit. But that wasn't the only cost. A fine was levied, not as punishment alone, but to cover the perceived risk, the administrative burden, the symbolic breach. The amount may not have seemed enormous to those at court, but for a subsistence farmer, whose entire profit margin rested on a few good weeks in late summer, it was catastrophic. One missed seal, one forgotten stamp, and now the market was lost. The grain was gone. The fine had to be paid in coin, not kind. And coin was always harder to find. To do so, he might have had to sell something, tools, seed, or part of next season's lease. Or he might have borrowed, indebting himself to a moneylender or neighbor, knowing he'd spend months working just to restore balance. In the manorial system, where the power structure was precise and impersonal, there was little space for leniency. Rules existed not only to prevent theft or evasion, but to reinforce hierarchy. A stamped sack said, "This farmer understands his place and the manor's oversight." An unmarked one said, "Maybe not." It's worth remembering that such regulations were not just for show. In many regions of medieval Europe, from England's feudal counties to the grain-counting communes of northern Italy, food fraud was a genuine concern. Grain could be mixed, adulterated, or stolen. Manorial lands were sometimes passed through by smugglers. And toll collectors wanted their share. Still, to the farmer, it must have felt like a punishment out of scale with the mistake. He did not steal. He did not lie. He simply forgot the mark. There are records, scattered through manor court rolls, of similar cases. A tenant fined for missing branding on sheep. A widow charged for transporting kindling without proof of collection rights. A miller accused of undermarking flour sacks during a lean harvest. Always, the response was the same. The system's rules mattered more than the individual's story. What became of our farmer? The records don't say. They rarely do. He may have finished the season in debt, borrowing seed from another villager. He may have moved or renegotiated his lease, or fallen into arrears the following year. It's unlikely he ever forgot the stamp again. But the bruise left behind, on trust, on stability, on pride, would remain. And so now, if you picture him again, walking the path with the sack across his shoulder, imagine the air cool and silent around him. No one watching. No one speaking. Just the steady weight of what he carries. And the invisible cost of what he didn't mark. The woman who gathered shellfish from a forbidden shore. Imagine a gray morning on the coast, the kind where mist lingers just above the sea and the cries of gulls echo between scattered boulders. The rocks are slick with brine, clustered with tiny barnacles and shivering seaweed. Waves move in a steady rhythm, neither violent nor calm, simply enduring as they have for centuries. Along this cold shore, a solitary woman walks, her skirts hiked high, feet numb to the water's bite. She moves with purpose, searching among tide pools and crevices for the humble food the sea can offer. Limpets clinging tight to the rocks, mussels dark and glistening, small snails hiding beneath weed. She pries them loose with an old knife, tucking each find into the apron knotted at her waist. Her hands are red from cold and salt, but her thoughts remain steady. Today, there might be enough for a thin stew, a bit of broth to fill the bellies at home. But the shore is not hers. Long ago, this sweep of coast became the property of a local lord, a monastery, or the crown itself. What once belonged to all, shore, forest, pasture, was claimed, measured, marked by law. Now, even what the sea leaves behind with each tide is regulated. Gathering shellfish is forbidden without leave. The rights to harvest, to fish, to gather, are granted only by favor, purchase, or ancient inheritance. For a poor woman without such rights, hunger is not reason enough. Still, hunger compels. When you wake to empty cupboards and children waiting, the rules of property feel distant, even strange. The law is real, but so is the ache in your stomach. So, she keeps her head down, hoping the guards will not walk the beach this morning. But on this day, the silence breaks. The crunch of boots on pebbles. The low voices of men in livery, carrying staves, eyes trained to notice what others would ignore. They see her apron, bulging with shells. She cannot run, her guilt is obvious. There is nowhere to hide on open rock. She is brought to the village square. It is not a trial in the sense of judges and robes, but a swift, communal reckoning. Neighbors gather, some with pity, some with the nervous relief that, today, it is not them. The law demands not a cell, but penance, public, memorable, and quietly humiliating. Her punishment is simple but effective. She must stand, head bowed, apron still heavy with the evidence of her hunger. Perhaps she must recite her wrongdoing. Perhaps she must wear a placard or a simple mark, a sign of her trespass for all to see. There are no stocks, no lash. Yet the weight of eyes is heavier than stone. Shame is a tool as old as law itself. For those with little to lose, the threat of fines or prison holds little power. But shame lingers, on the tongue of the neighbor, in the cautious glances of friends, in the memory of her children. It is the kind of punishment that outlives the moment. This was not unique to her village, nor to her century. Across much of medieval and early modern Europe, the right to gather food from wild places was fiercely guarded by the powerful. Lords protected their rivers and forests. Monasteries claimed beaches and salt pans. The sea's bounty, once common to all, became a privilege. Even the act of gathering driftwood, cutting turf, or fishing for eels could carry risk. Some communities tried to carve out exceptions, certain feast days, the rights of widows, ancient customary privileges, but these were always at risk of being revoked or reinterpreted by those in charge. In times of famine or hardship, rules tightened. The hungry paid the price. For the woman on the shore, the cost was a public wound to her dignity. She may have carried it quietly for years, marked by a memory more lasting than hunger. Her children, perhaps, remembered the day others averted their gaze, or the cold way someone handed back her apron. It is easy now, from a distance, to ask why people accepted such rules, why they let property be drawn out to the very line where waves met stone. But hunger bends principle. When food is scarce, people risk much for little, one meal at a time. The shellfish she gathered would not have made her rich. It would barely have filled her pot. Yet for breaking the boundaries set by others, she was made into an example. The message was not for her alone, but for all who watched. These shores are not yours. History rarely records her name. Court rolls may list a woman found gathering without leave, and mark her punishment in a line or two. The shore, meanwhile, forgets nothing. Every tide brings new shells, new life, new possibility. The rocks keep no memory of shame, only of footsteps, vanishing at the water's edge. And so, as you rest, imagine her there again on the forbidden shore, her hunger momentarily eased, her spirit heavy, yet unchanged in the face of tides that wash away all marks but those we carry within. She was quiet, but not forgotten. The child who stepped into a fountain to cool his feet, imagine the press of summer, air so thick it slows your thoughts, sun pooling on stone until the whole world seems to glow. The year is a century lost to memory, in a walled estate on the edge of a thriving village. The Lord's house rises in pale stone, casting broad shadows over walled gardens and carved hedges. At the heart of the courtyard, a fountain sings, a rare luxury, its waters caught in a shallow basin of carved marble, cold and clear, reflecting blue sky and drifting leaves. The fountain was not for everyone. It was a symbol of order, wealth, and the careful hierarchy that shaped daily life. Water itself was precious, but a fountain, meant for beauty and display, not for need, was a marker of power. It told visitors, guests, and villagers where the lines of privilege ran. To belong in the inner courtyard was to be counted among the estate's people, subject to its rules and its gaze. In this heat, a child wandered close. Perhaps he lived in the estate's outer buildings, son to a steward or a kitchen worker, or perhaps his family had business in the manor that day. A delivery, a request, a meeting. Small feet pattered on flagstones, breathless with the stifling sun. The fountain sparkled, an invitation both innocent and forbidden. There is a universal logic to childhood. Where there is water, feet will follow. The child stepped closer, drawn by the bright play of sun on water, the gentle splash echoing between stone walls. In that courtyard, for a moment, the rest of the world faded. The rules of hierarchy, the sharp edges of custom, all vanished into the simple pleasure of cool water. He slipped off his shoes, rolled up the hem of his tunic, and climbed into the shallow basin. The shock of cold, delightful, electric, sent him giggling, toes curling against polished stone. He may have splashed, scooped up water to his neck, or simply stood still, savoring relief from the sun. His laughter was light, echoing in the empty air. But the estate was not empty. Someone saw, a maid, a gardener, a passing squire. There are always eyes in places of order. The child was soon plucked from the basin, startled and dripping, innocence colliding with custom. What followed was not a beating or a spectacle. In such societies, punishment often took subtler forms, especially for those of lower status. Word reached the lord or his steward. The infraction was clear. The child had violated the dignity of the estate, a transgression not of harm, but of decorum. The fountain's waters were not for peasants' feet. The act was seen as an insult to the estate's order, an embarrassment that demanded response. The family was summoned. Perhaps the child's parents stood before the manor steward in humble clothes, heads bowed. They apologized, offered explanation. He is young, the day was hot, but the rules were unmoved. To allow such a breach without consequence would risk eroding the boundaries that kept society in place. A fine was levied, not a small fee, but a sum designed to sting, a penalty meant to remind the village of its place. The family's savings, meager coins set aside for winter, a daughter's shoes, a patch for a leaking roof, were handed over, all for a child's bare feet in a forbidden fountain. The fine was not just financial. It was a weight that settled in the rhythms of daily life. Extra hours in the field, meals thinned by a missing loaf, small dreams postponed. For the child, perhaps the lesson was less clear. He may have remembered only the cold splash, the hands lifting him out, the silence that followed. For the family, it was a reminder that even the smallest joys could have a cost. The estate returned to order. The fountain's surface calmed, its waters undisturbed. The child kept to the shadows, the family more cautious. The rules remained, invisible but solid, defining who could linger in the sun, who could touch the cool stone, who could laugh too loudly in the wrong place. Yet, beneath the surface, stories like this rippled through the memory of the village. They were repeated not with anger, but with a kind of resigned understanding. These were the customs that shaped life, not always cruel, but always present, always quietly instructive. Close your eyes and picture it now. Sunlight on marble, the hush of summer, a small figure standing with feet in cool water, caught between innocence and order. The world is unchanged, but the memory lingers, like the sound of water echoing against stone, gentle, brief, and fading slowly into the heat of the day. The potter who sold one cup with a hairline crack. Imagine yourself on a slow, misty morning in a medieval market town. The air is thick with the earthy scent of clay and ash, and the narrow lanes are lined with stalls covered in burlap and faded linen. In the heart of this quiet bustle, you'll find the potter's shop, a low, timbered building, windows clouded with the memory of 1,000 kiln firings, shelves crowded with the dull sheen of earthenware jugs and simple, serviceable cups. In such a world, a pot was not just an object but a lifeline. Vessels for water, for food, for ritual. Made to last, yet always, somehow, impermanent. Each cup held the labor of hands and the hope that the glaze would not spiderweb with faults when the kiln cooled. Potters learned to read their wares like fortunes, searching for invisible threats beneath every smooth curve. The potter in this story, his name lost, like so many, was neither renowned nor notorious. He was steady, a man who worked dawn to dusk, kneading clay by lamplight, coaxing new shapes from earth with fingers worn blunt. His livelihood depended on skill, but also on trust. Reputation in a guild town was currency as tangible as silver coins. One morning, a customer, perhaps a merchant's wife or a steward for a grander household, purchased a cup. At a glance, it was fine, the curve even, the rim clean, the glaze pale blue as spring rain. But later, under better light or the pressure of pouring, a faint hairline crack revealed itself, snaking from base to lip. The flaw was nearly invisible, but once seen, it could not be unseen. Water seeped through in a slow, persistent bead. Accusation came swiftly. In small towns, rumors pass faster than carriages. The customer brought the cup back, holding it aloft as evidence. This was sold to me as whole, but it is not whole. It was always cracked. The potter must have known. The crowd murmured. Some remembered bargains struck at his counter, others remembered cups that chipped too soon or jugs that held firm for years. The matter did not stay in the street. It went to the guild. Potters' guilds were as strict as any noble court, for their collective reputation determined all members' survival. They examined the cup, turning it in the light, tapping gently with a wooden rod. Was the crack the fault of the kiln or of the craftsman? Was it a mistake or a deliberate deceit? The guild's verdict was swift and public. They judged that the potter must have seen the crack. A craftsman knows his work, after all. To have sold it was to cheat the trust of his neighbors. To allow even one flawed cup into a customer's hands was to endanger the good name of all potters in town. The punishment was severe, but common. His shop was closed, the door sealed with wax and the guild's mark, and he was compelled to leave the town. No cart, no goods, nothing but his tools and the clothes he wore. Exile was not always noisy. There was no shouting, no stone-throwing crowd. Just a steady, silent emptying of a life. The potter packed what little he could, wooden ribs, throwing wire, a few favorite brushes, and left behind the shelves he'd built, the wheel smooth from years of spinning, the kiln that once felt like an extension of his own heart. To understand the harshness, you must know what a medieval guild meant. It was not just a union, but a shield and a judge, a source of shared pride and discipline. The integrity of every object sold bore the invisible stamp of dozens of lives and livelihoods. If one man was found wanting, all felt the loss. In those days, to move to a new town was to start as a stranger. Every guild had records, and whispers could travel with the same swiftness as a stamped letter. The potter might find work as a journeyman, if someone would vouch for him, but advancement was hard. Trust, once broken, rarely healed. He would carry the weight of his tools, heavy, familiar, but no longer comforting. Each time he threw a new cup, he'd search for cracks, haunted by the memory of one mistake. Daily life in such towns was shaped by unspoken contracts. The baker's bread must rise, the cobbler's shoes must last, the potter's wares must hold water. If you failed, the cost was more than coin. It was standing, it was belonging. A single flaw could tip the balance between survival and exile. Evenings, in his new home, if he found one, the potter might sit by a different fire, listening to the hush of unfamiliar voices. He would shape new clay, but never again with the same certainty. Perhaps he grew wary, never glazing more than he could examine by lamplight, discarding every vessel with even a hint of imperfection. Or perhaps he stopped making cups entirely, focusing on bricks or tiles, things less likely to betray him. The potter's story is a quiet reminder, not of dramatic betrayal, but of the constant tension between pride in one's work and the fear of unnoticed flaws. In a world without forgiveness for small mistakes, each act was watched, each sale a test. And so, in the fading light of a forgotten town, an empty workshop stands, dusty, silent, its shelves still holding the ghosts of cups and bowls that will never be filled. The potter moves on, the crack in the cup now a crack in his life, both nearly invisible, both impossible to repair. This, too, was history, not the battles or the banners, but the daily, careful work of trust, lost in a single, slender line. The shepherd who let sheep stray onto church land. Imagine the soft, early light of a pastoral morning settling over a small medieval village. The mist still clings to the low hills, and the gentle bleating of sheep drifts through the air, mingling with the scent of dew-soaked grass and warm earth. The shepherd's crook rests lightly in his hand as he guides his flock through familiar fields, moving slowly beneath the pale sky. This shepherd, let us call him Wilfred, was a man of modest means, entrusted with the care of the village's sheep. His life was measured by the rhythm of the seasons, the rise and fall of the sun, and the quiet, steady movement of his animals across the hills and meadows. For Wilfred, the sheep were not merely beasts of burden but the source of his family's survival, wool for warmth, and lambs for sustenance. The boundaries of the village were marked not only by stones and hedges but by a crumbling old wall, once a grand barrier enclosing church lands, now weathered by time and neglected by those who had long since stopped tending it. Beyond that wall lay the parish's grazing grounds, reserved strictly for the church's own livestock. These lands were valuable, carefully guarded by the ecclesiastical authorities who saw them as a source of income and influence. One afternoon, as Wilfred's attention drifted, perhaps caught by the distant call of a hawk or the sudden stir of wind in the trees, a pair of his sheep wandered through a breach in the old stone wall. The creatures meandered quietly among the sacred grounds, nibbling at grass that was not theirs to claim. To the casual observer, it was a minor slip easily overlooked in a day's long toil. But to the church officials, it was an affront. The ecclesiastical court was not known for leniency, especially when it came to their property. When the matter was brought before them, the shepherd found himself facing more than just a reprimand. The fine imposed was heavy, beyond what Wilfred could hope to pay. The penalty forbade him from grazing anywhere near the parish lands again. This ruling, in effect, stripped him of the very pasture he and his family had relied upon for generations. In medieval times, such decisions carried weight far beyond the courtroom. Land was the basis of livelihood, and the church was a powerful landholder. To be barred from grazing meant not just a loss of income but the erosion of a family's stability. Wilfred's prospects dimmed under the shadow of the fine, and the quiet threat of destitution loomed. The breach in the wall may have been small, but its consequences were vast. The shepherd's misstep was remembered in the village. Whispered warnings passed from one generation to the next. Children learned early that church property was to be respected without question, for the penalties were both material and spiritual. Life went on, but Wilfred's role changed. Without pasture, he was forced to seek work elsewhere, perhaps as a laborer in the fields or in the bustling village market. His connection to the land was broken, his place among the flocks diminished. The rhythm of his life, once steady and predictable, became uncertain and fraught. Yet this story, like many in the medieval world, reveals the delicate balance between authority and survival. It speaks to the power wielded by institutions and the fragile position of those who lived under their gaze. It reminds us that history is often shaped by moments as quiet as a stray sheep's wander and as profound as the loss of a home. So, when you next find yourself walking along a moss-covered wall or watching sheep graze beneath an ancient church tower, imagine Wilfred. Imagine the weight of responsibility in his steady hands, the care in his watchful eyes, and the harsh lesson taught by a moment's inattention. The past is never far away. It rests in stones, in stories, and in the soft footsteps of those who came before. The youth who sang a ballad mocking a minor official, imagine yourself in the warm glow of a tavern, the air thick with the scent of roasted meat, spilled ale, and the steady murmur of voices. The room is dimly lit by flickering candles and a crackling hearth. Rough wooden benches and tables crowd close, worn smooth by years of elbows and tankards. It is evening, a time when laborers, farmers, and townsfolk gather to share stories, drink their fill, and seek momentary escape from the burdens of daily life. In a corner, a young man stands. His clothes are plain but clean, his hands calloused but steady. He carries a lute slung over his back, and when the moment arises, he begins to sing. The song is a ballad, a rustic melody passed from mouth to mouth, filled with humor and pointed commentary. But tonight, his verses do not merely amuse, they mock. The target is a minor official in the town, perhaps a reeve, a tax collector, or a bailiff, known for his strictness and his prickly temper. The youth's song jabs at the official's habits, his reputation, even his mannerisms. It may poke fun at how he struts through the market square, or how his purse is always a little heavier after a day's work. To the tavern's crowd, such songs are common, a part of local tradition and social critique wrapped in rhyme. Yet, what might seem harmless revelry to some was a serious matter to others. In medieval towns, officials represented the power of the lord, the law, and order itself. To publicly ridicule them was to challenge authority, however small the official's rank might be. On this night, the official happened to be nearby. Perhaps he was returning from a meeting, or accompanying a noble's envoy. He heard the ballad, unmistakable and sharp. He recognized the youth's voice. What followed was swift and unforgiving. In the public square, beneath the gaze of the townsfolk, the youth was seized. The official invoked laws protecting his honor and office, laws that demanded respect be shown, or punishment would follow. The youth was dragged before the magistrates, accused of slander and disturbing the peace. The penalty was corporal and severe, flogging. The youth's back was lashed in the center of town, the crack of the whip mingling with the murmurs of the crowd. This public punishment served not only to chastise the offender but to deter others who might voice similar jests. But the flogging was not the end. The youth was also banished, exiled from the town he had known all his life. To be cast out was to be cut off from family, work, and community. It meant wandering, uncertainty, and the harshness of starting anew elsewhere, often in hostile or unknown places. For a young man whose prospects were already limited by class and circumstance, such exile was devastating. The ballad that had brought laughter in the tavern had ended his future. This story is not unique in the medieval world. Across towns and villages, songs and poems were powerful vehicles of social commentary but also risk. Bards and minstrels tread a fine line between humor and offense. Those who misjudged the limits could suffer harsh consequences. Officials, even minor ones, often sought to protect their dignity fiercely. To be mocked was to lose face, and in societies deeply rooted in hierarchy and respect, loss of face translated to loss of power. At the same time, this tale reminds us of the tensions beneath the surface of medieval life. The common people had ways to express dissatisfaction, to resist in small gestures. The joke, the ballad, the whispered story. But these gestures were always shadowed by risk, especially when aimed at those who wielded authority. Imagine now the youth, alone on a dusty road beyond the town's gates, the echoes of the tavern's laughter replaced by silence. The lute is gone or broken, the ballads he once sang now forbidden. Ahead lies uncertainty, but also the resilience that centuries of such wanderers have known. And as you drift with this thought, imagine the quiet power of a song. A melody can build bridges or burn them. It can offer solace or provoke punishment. In medieval towns where words were both weapons and comforts, the fate of a youth could turn on a single verse.